The man along the parapet moved with the measured rhythm of habit, not heroics. Years of tending hives had taught him how to lift a skep so the combs stayed intact, how to feel its weight and the low vibration of thousands of insects inside. Now those same movements directed the course of a battle. He tilted another wicker dome over the battlement, gauged the wind off the Baltic, and chose the densest cluster of shields below. His hands, roughened by tools and smoke, knocked away the clay plug that usually sealed the hive for transport. Instead of easing the bees toward flowering clover, he sent them plunging into iron and leather. The skep burst apart against the rim of a shield, combs shattering, honey spraying across helmets and quilted coats. The sticky film trapped stinging insects against exposed skin, driving them up sleeves, under necklines, and into the dark gaps behind mail coifs. Below, attackers who had trained for sword strokes and arrow volleys found no defense against the invisible panic of venom and buzzing wings. Some tore off helmets and gloves, abandoning ladders to tumble into the churned mud. Others backed away in confusion, ranks opening as horses reared and bolted under the sudden assault. Above them, the landholder hauled another hive into place, breathing through a damp cloth, fully aware of how quickly enraged bees overwhelmed any disciplined advance. Wooden towers, stone ramparts, and earthworks had rarely stood alone in medieval defense. Across Europe, hives of honeybees and nests of wasps hung from eaves and orchard trees, close to the very walls that might one day need protection. Monastic cartularies, town regulations, and rural law codes recorded carefully tended apiaries as valuable property, but they also revealed a second purpose. Under the right hands, these swarming colonies became living projectiles, ready to turn the air itself into a weapon. In Norse and later Scandinavian accounts, defenders on timber palisades and rough stone keeps had seized plaited skeps and flung them down upon men at the gates. The sagas and local chronicles described besiegers scattering in confusion as bees burst from the shattered baskets, stinging at eyes and exposed skin. In some stories, hives were lowered on ropes and then smashed against shields and helmets, filling narrow approaches and bridgeways with a panicked, stinging cloud that made ordered assault impossible. Central European and Italian records showed how deliberate this practice had become. Inventories of fortifications listed bee skeps stored alongside stones, pitch and lime on walkways and in wall towers. Late medieval German and Italian writers even named such stores Zeidelwehre, bee weapons, acknowledging them as part of regular defensive equipment. Manuals on siegecraft and reports from border fortresses noted how garrisons broke open hives over ladders and siege towers, using the insect's fury to strip armoured men of cohesion long before steel could reach them. The stronghold stood low in the landscape, ringed by a shallow moat and earth bank, its timber palisade darkened by rain and smoke from the hearths within. Around it stretched fields and small hay meadows dotted with woven skeps where bees had foraged through the brief northern summer. When armed riders and footmen appeared on the far side of the marshy ground, the household hurriedly drove livestock inside the yard, dragged ploughs and carts toward the gate, and moved sacks of grain and tools up against the inner walls. The beekeeper moved through the bustle with practiced calm, lifting the squat straw hives one by one, judging their weight and the hum inside. These colonies had been prepared for winter and were strong, with combs heavy with stores. He ordered them carried up to the parapet walk that ran along the inner side of the palisade, near the points where ladders would most likely be set. Servants spread ash and damp earth to create level platforms, while others fetched coarse cloths, pitch and kindling, turning the familiar tools of honey and wax production toward a different purpose. Outside, the attackers tested the soft ground with poles and makeshift fascines, seeking paths over ditches and through reeds. Shields and mail caught the grey light as they advanced with ladders and bundles of brush to choke the moat. Inside the enclosure, the beekeeper checked the wind, watching how smoke from the chimney drifted along the palisade. He positioned the hives where an updraft would carry any disturbance outward, then had water drawn and cloths soaked, ready to seal and jolt each skep at the moment the first helmets and hands rose into view below the wall. Fields stretched around the homestead, broken by strips of barley and rye, with a small orchard leaning against the slope. The defensive works rose only a little above the land. An earthen bank thrown up by many hands, a ditch that collected rainwater, and a timber palisade darkened by weather and smoke. At the centre stood a stout hall or low tower, its plank walls chinked with clay. Chickens scratched by the gate, pigs rooted at the edge of the midden, and smoke drifted from a central hearth where grain, meat and herbs dried in the rafters. Along the inner edge of the yard, rows of straw skeps lined up beneath woven hurdles, their domed shapes crowded with foraging bees. Beyond them, a few log hives lay hollowed and capped, the wood split by years of use. Workers moved carefully among them, with specialized knives and smouldering tinders, trimming comb and calming swarms. The air hummed, full of the scent of wax and propolis, while nearby trees showed signs of careful pollarding, cut high to spare blossoms and shelter the bees that worked the surrounding fields and hedges. Wax from places like this fed church treasuries and illuminated stone naves from York to Lubeck, shaped into candles recorded by monastic scribes in rent rolls and tithe lists. Honey flowed into barrels and pots, sweetening ale, preserving fruit, and flavouring dishes in households that rarely saw imported sugar. Excavated skeps and hive tools from Denmark, Germany and England matched the objects resting here in the yard, showing how widespread this craft had been. For the man tending these hives, the bees embodied stored labour, income, and a disciplined power waiting within their ordered combs. Dust rose first, a thin smear along the track that cut through fields of rye and scattered pasture. Then the helmets appeared, dull glints above leather and mail, as a column of armed men wound toward the timbered farmstead. Their horses moved at a deliberate walk, spears and crossbows carried with an ease that spoke of practice rather than haste. At the sight of them, workers in the yard dropped tools and ran for the main house, dragging children and grain baskets behind them. The intruders spread out with the assurance of men who expected little resistance. Some dismounted, tying reins to fence posts, while others rode closer to the outer palisade, probing its height with spear shafts. A handful carried iron hooks lashed to poles, the kind used to drag down plank walls and peel sharpened stakes from their sockets. Farther back, men unloaded bundles of brush and faggots, ready to heap them against gates and doors, to choke ditches and smother shallow moats. Inside the enclosure, the mood tightened. Household retainers hauled sacks of grain, small barrels, and loose stones toward the upper floor of the main building, where shutters overlooked the yard and the outer fence. A kettle went over the hearth, water sloshing as it heated. Someone drove the cattle and sheep into a cramped corner, barricading them with carts. Near the storage sheds, rows of woven skeps and wooden box hives stood stacked and humming, a dense reserve of restless, winged noise awaiting disturbance. The defender stood in the cramped ward and measured the thin line of men along the walls. Vegetius's counsel on layered defences and relentless missile fire hung in his memory, but the ramparts could not be manned as the old treaties demanded. The manuals spoke of boiling water, lime and stones hurled from crowded battlements. Here only a few archers watched the ladders. Outside, the besiegers tightened their lines, preparing rams and mantlets for a methodical grinding assault. He walked the length of the inner yard, past stacked timber and empty barrels, until his gaze settled on the apiary pressed against the sun-warmed wall. Dozens of straw skeps shimmered with life, each a dense, murmuring sphere of wings and venom. Notes in monastic margins had described how smoke quieted bees, how careless jolts enraged them, how colonies swarmed when disturbed in heat and light. Here, each hive waited as a coiled force far more numerous than any garrison. He recalled ash-stained accounts of hives rolled from parapets in southern fortresses and jars of bees flung from Genoese and Venetian decks onto crowded enemy ships. Those reports described screaming crews abandoning oars and assault parties breaking as insects swarmed under helmets and into mail. The same principle now lay within his reach. With rope, hooks, and a few steady hands, the castle's quiet apiary could become a storm, turning the walls into a hazard no ladder team expected. Men bent under the weight of the woven skeps as they climbed, boots scraping on the ladder rungs, breaths short with effort and fear. Along the wall walk, they laid the hives down with care rather than haste, then smashed away the thin daub that had sealed the entrances. A low, angry hum thickened in the air. Below, shields lifted and ladders rattled against stone, just as hands hefted the hives to the parapet's edge. The first skeps hit the packed earth and armour with a dull, ripping thud, straw exploding outward in ragged clumps. Internal combs tore apart, honey splashed, and thousands of bees burst into confused flight. Disturbed brood and crushed workers released alarm pheromones, a sharp scent that spread like smoke through the chaos. Drawn to movement and carbon dioxide in the soldier's breath, the bees converged on faces, wrists and necks, stinging any exposed patch of skin they found. Clusters formed around helmet rims and mail coifs, bees crawling relentlessly toward eyes and mouths. Some forced their way under collars and up sleeves, following the heat and sweat trapped beneath layered garments. Men clawed at their own armor in blind desperation, dropping shields and weapons as stings multiplied. Accounts from similar sieges described soldiers permanently blinded and entire assaults collapsing when panicked fighters pushed back from the ladders, their tight formation dissolving under the swarming attack. Below the walls, men tightened wet hides over mail and helmets, copying methods once used against burning oil and falling stones. Heavy cloth muffled the clatter of armour, but also their breathing, and shield lines thickened as boards lifted awkwardly toward the parapet, turned now into crude barriers against insects. Smoke from hastily lit piles of damp brush drifted upward, pushed by shields and spears, the attackers hoping it would fog the air and smother the bees' fury. The makeshift protections quickly betrayed their limits. Leather hoods trapped heat beneath iron, and gloved hands tugged at choking bindings as sweat streamed into stinging eyes. Men stumbled when cloaks caught on jagged stones, shield edges clipped ankles, and shouted orders dissolved inside layers of cloth. Arrows loosed in confusion passed wide of the battlements. As the formation thickened near the base of the wall, coordination frayed, and the slow advance left clusters of soldiers standing exposed in tight knots. Above them, a single figure who had long moved calmly among hives watched for these moments when bodies pressed together. More wicker containers tipped, Their occupants jarred into violent flight and dropped where helmets and shields already strained defenders' opponents. The swarms poured into gaps around collars and cuffs, the same weakness exploited in German and Eastern European sieges, where bee baskets and wasp nests had driven men from ladders. Here, too, scaling efforts faltered as pain and panic rolled through the besieging ranks. Along the trampled approaches below the walls, discarded shields and torn gambesons lay beside hives shattered into splinters and comb. Men who had rushed the gate now sat with faces swollen grotesquely, eyelids sealed, lips ballooned until speech turned to muffled sounds. Some clawed at their throats as physicians and chaplains worked in haste, lancing stings, pressing cool poultices of plantain and honey, murmuring prayers from familiar miracle tales that warned of stinging swarms turned against the unwary. The attackers' camp quieted, the usual clamour of sharpening iron replaced by low arguments around watch fires. Messengers moved between tents, stepping past men who still rubbed burning eyes or lay restless with fevers, their breathing ragged. Captains studied the stout walls, now associated less with stone than with the memory of buzzing clouds. Rumours spread that some victims had died not from wounds of steel but from hidden weakness in the body that sudden venom had revealed, a peril only later called anaphylactic shock. Within the fortified farmstead, the courtyard showed signs of strain yet remained unbroken. Patched timbers, scorched earth, and carefully rehoused colonies rebuilt from surviving swarms. Nearby fields stayed cultivated, an unusual outcome in a landscape where siege often meant burned crops and abandoned homesteads. Word of the stinging defence travelled along market roads and church paths, folded into feud stories and local annals. In Danish and neighbouring districts, talk of bee-defended farms and small bee castles lingered, marking places where patient beekeeping had once carried the weight of arms. Along the ramparts of ancient hilltop towns, wooden hives once rested beside piles of stones and jars of oil. When enemy ladders scraped against the walls, defenders pried loose the lids and hurled the hives downward. Roman and Greek writers described shields dropping as swarming bees crawled into armour gaps and under tunics. Panic spread faster than wounds did, yet the confusion opened breaches in otherwise disciplined ranks and forced assaults back from the gates. Centuries later, hornets and bees unsettled armies on other frontiers. Byzantine chronicles told of nests flung into siege trenches, where trapped soldiers thrashed in narrow works as insects swarmed the confined air. Arab accounts mentioned defenders driving off raiders in mountain passes with baskets of disturbed hornets. In the forests and timber stockades of Slavic and German lands, hollow logs that sheltered bees became deliberate obstacles rolled or dropped to break charges and scatter advancing men among the trees. Early modern cavalry also met these small defenders, when estate owners and village militias loosed hives into horse lines, sending stung animals crashing through formations. Bees had evolved to defend their colonies with alarm pheromones, massed stings, and relentless pursuit of perceived intruders. Medieval people only partly understood this, yet they learned to trigger it at the right moment. On a Danish farmstead, one beekeeper's skill and nerve turned a familiar craft into a makeshift fortress long enough to keep his world intact.